In this tutorial, I demonstrate how to use Unity's standard free terrain tool to create basic terrains for your games. Your first step should be logging into the asset store and then doing a search for terrain sample, and you'll see this tool here, the terrain sample asset pack. You want to add that to your assets by clicking on the link. I've already added it to my assets, so it's grayed out. But once you've downloaded it, you can go ahead and close your browser and open up Unity. Go to the package manager and do a search for the sample, terrain sample asset pack here, and import it. Click on the import button, and that'll give you a list of all of the different assets. Later on, as you learn more about this tool, you can uncheck some of these options, but for now, let's go ahead and install everything. Actually, I should say, let's go ahead and import everything. So you'll need to do this every time you start up a new project. You'll only need to download it from the asset store once, and then notice that that worked. So I'm going to close the program manager, and now when you right-click on the 3D object, you'll have a new option here, terrain. So go ahead and do that. Right-click in the hierarchy. Under 3D object, choose the terrain option, and that will bring you a 1 by 1 by 1 terrain over here, scale. That's about a 1 kilometer, I believe that is. First thing we'll do is, with the terrain selected here in your hierarchy, go to the inspector and turn off the static setting. This will turn off the light baking, which can really slow your computer down and isn't needed when we're creating our terrains. First thing we'll do now is we will raise or lower our flat terrain to create our landscape. So click over here in the terrain component, the second button, the paint terrain button, and set the drop down here to paint texture. Let's add a texture to our plain terrain here so we can see the hills and valleys a little bit easier. So from here, click on Edit Terrain Layers, and then add a layer. This will bring up the various materials, terrain materials that came with your standard asset. You can choose any of these, but maybe the best one to start with is the dirt. Double click on that, and then notice it will convert all of your terrain to that texture material. So now we can start raising and lowering the terrain to create mountains and valleys and so on. To do that, click on the drop down and choose Raise or Lower Terrain. So if you click, first you will choose a brush over here. I recommend choosing one of these terrain brushes that came with your standard asset when you loaded your terrain asset, and then raising the brush size so that it doesn't cover the entire terrain, because you're probably going to want to create an island so you don't get some weird edging there. And then we'll just make the ocean around it, and so it will then go into infinity and will look a lot better. So something like this is good. Change the opacity, turn that down. The lower it is, the slower this will be building and the more control you'll have. So the way this works is you just simply click and hold the mouse down, and then notice that it's raising my terrain. If I bring up the opacity, you can see that it raises it up higher. If you hold down the Shift key, that will lower the terrain. So by clicking and shifting, you can kind of create a mountain landscape with valleys. My tip is to go ahead and either click very lightly or turn down the opacity. Keep your mouse moving so that you get a more gentle, gradual approach. And notice that I'm going in between those two ridges with my Shift key held down to lower the terrain. And you can use several different brushes. Again, I would keep the edges flat so that you have an island when we're done, and experiment. If you find that you've kind of made a mess, you can go over here to the drop down and click on Set Height here, and you can flatten everything to start over again. And then I'm kind of moving in a circle, keeping my mouse moving, starting with a relatively small brush, go back to lower, raise terrain, and you can see that I'm gradually raising that terrain up, holding down the Shift key to create valleys, and again adjusting. I would start with a larger brush size and then go smaller as you build your Notice that that's probably opacity is too high. You can also undo your last step or last several steps by hitting Command Z or Control Z. And in this way, kind of build your terrains. There's several ways to do this. I think this is maybe the way you'll use it the most when you've already got a terrain and you want to make some small adjustments. But I'm moving my mouse around with a very low opacity, so don't get very large ridges and things that are unrealistic like that perhaps. And then I'm also lowering it to get valleys and so on. There's also smooth height if you get something that's a little bit too jagged. And likewise, you can hold the Shift key down to do different settings. So try experimenting with that for a little while. And then after you've done that, you might want to go ahead and set height and flatten the tile. And then the other way to create terrains is with stamps. So what we can do is we can go over here to the stamp tool, and we can stamp a terrain using one of these brushes. And what this will do is it will create larger terrain blocks based on, a mountain or a valley, a ridge. Notice if I do this one, and again, you want to set your brush size so that it doesn't overwhelm the terrain, and we want to set the stamp height here to a maximum value. I'm kind of stamping this terrain using the various stamps here. I can left click on the stamp brush onto the terrain. You can also hold the control and the mouse wheel to adjust the height. Notice it kind of gives you a preview of what this will look like as you bring in the various stamps here. Try both, and you'll find that they're good for different kinds of things, but experiment with this one as well and generate yourself several terrains. You can also create another terrain and move it, and then continue working on stamping the second terrain. Notice if this one doesn't have the material on it. And in this way, you can kind of practice using both tools. Now, once you've created your basic terrain with the stamp tool, you can always go back to the Paint Terrain tool and raise and lower that terrain. Again, probably starting with a smaller brush size and a very low opacity. You can come in here and choose a brush and zoom in, and then make modifications to that terrain. Again, holding down the Shift key will lower the terrain. So you can see I'm doing here. Letting go of the Shift key will raise the terrain. So you can thereby make modifications to this terrain. Again, I suggest starting with an island so that you can paint essentially the blue around the edges so that it creates a continuous terrain. And again, I recommend going with a very low opacity. Now, one interesting tool that I'm going to point out before we leave here is you can create, by setting the height, you can create plateaus. So I'm going to set the height to 200, and then notice that as I raise this terrain, it goes to 200 and then it stops. So you can kind of create some interesting plateau effects. If we set our height to 140, and then notice that as I raise the terrain there, it actually lowers it to 140 and then sets like a table there. So I can adjust 230, and I can then click here. And then notice that the terrain goes all the way up to 230 and then it flattens out. So you can kind of create some terraces. So what you may want to do is set up a series of plateaus here so you can put in your buildings or castles or whatever. But that's kind of an interesting effect here by going to the set height and setting the height to a value so that you get these flat shelves where you can actually place your castles and other buildings. So to finish my terrain here, to go to the next lesson, I've used the raise or lower terrain tool, and I've shift clicked it to create some gullies here all the way down to sea level right there. I've also used the smooth height tool to kind of smooth everything out so I don't have those rough edges, kind of like adding erosion to it. And we're now ready to go ahead and start adding textures to this terrain, much as we did over here with a single dirt texture.